The rain against the windshield was a frantic, desperate drumbeat, matching the terrified pounding in Leona Hayes's chest. The ancient, primeval forests of Washington state closed in around the winding, treacherous road, a suffocating wall of dark, wet green and impenetrable shadow. The wipers on her sputtering old sedan, a car that had cost her last normal paycheck, fought a losing battle against the deluge, revealing the world in frantic, sweeping glimpses of slick asphalt and skeletal black branches. She was clutching the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles were bone-white. This wasn't just a job, it was the end of the line. Her savings were gone, evaporated by the mountain of medical debts her mother's illness had left behind, and this offer, this strange, secretive, impossibly well-paying offer, was the only thing keeping her head above water. The summons had come from Dr. Aris Bishop, her former mentor, a brilliant but eccentric man, and the only professor at her nursing college who had seen past her quiet, unassuming demeanor to the sharp, analytical mind beneath. His email had been scant on details but heavy with urgency. "Leona, I have a private case. It requires absolute discretion and your specific skills in hematology. The compensation is significant, but the environment is profoundly isolated. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't critical. Come to Ravencrest Manor. Trust me." Trust him. That's what she was running on. Because as the wrought iron gates of Ravencrest Manor loomed out of the mist, looking like a row of jagged black teeth in the gloom, her trust was the only currency she had left. The manor itself was a Gothic marvel, or perhaps a nightmare, perched on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the turbulent gray churn of the Pacific coast far below. Stone towers, slick with rain, pierced the bruised purple sky, and 1,000 dark windows seemed to watch her navigate the final, winding, cliffside approach. The house didn't just occupy the landscape, it dominated it, like a predator crouched in the storm. She parked the car, the engine dying with a rattling cough. Shielding her head with her worn wool coat, she ran through the downpour to the massive carved oak doors. Before she could even find the knocker, the right door swung open with a heavy, soundless groan that was more unnerving than a creak. A woman who looked as if she were carved from the same severe damp stone as the manor stood in the aperture. She was tall, rail-thin, and dressed in a practical, high-collared black dress that looked decades out of style. Her gray hair was pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull her face taut, stretching the pale parchment of her skin over sharp cheekbones. "Miss Hayes," the woman stated. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement of an inconvenient fact. "I am Mrs. Thorne, the housekeeper. Dr. Bishop is waiting for you in the library." Leona murmured a "Thank you," her voice sounding small and weak in the cavernous space. She followed the woman, dripping rainwater onto priceless, threadbare antique rugs. The silence of the house was absolute, a palpable, heavy presence. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty, as if the very air had been vacuumed of sound, life, and warmth. Her own footsteps, and the sharp, disapproving click of Mrs. Thorne's heels on the marble floor, echoed unnaturally. They passed portraits of dark-eyed ancestors, austere, bearded men, and pale, severe women, their painted eyes all sharing the same unnerving, possessive stare. Rooms, glimpsed through open doorways, were shrouded in dust covers, entire wings of the house frozen in time, smelling of dust, salt air, and decay. The library was the only room that felt remotely alive, and only because a massive fireplace crackled with a much-needed blaze. Dr. Aris Bishop stood by a towering, rain-lashed window, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked much older than she remembered from college, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders slumped with a fatigue that went beyond lack of sleep. "Eris," Leona said, relief flooding her voice, warming her for the first time that day. He turned, and a small, deeply tired smile touched his lips. "Leona, thank you for coming. I know this was abrupt." His office, this library, smelled of old paper, leather, floor polish, and something else. A faint, sterile antiseptic odor that seemed starkly out of place. The atmosphere was heavier than any hospital waiting room, thick with unasked questions. "You said it was urgent," Leona said, pulling off her damp coat. "You said you needed my hematology skills. What kind of patient is this? What's really going on?" Dr. Bishop studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing, as if weighing what to say. "We have a patient, Leona, who requires constant, specialized care. But this job, it's not for the weak-hearted. I need to be clear about that. The last 3 nurses couldn't handle it. They left. One, a very experienced man from Seattle, simply walked out in the middle of the night, left his car, and took a cab back to the city. Another, she just said the house was too cold." Leona's brows furrowed. "Not for the weak-hearted? Eris? What does that mean? What kind of patient?" He gestured not to a medical file but to a thick, leather-bound book on his desk. "Lord Adrian Marlowe," he said, his voice dropping. Leona's breath caught. She didn't recognize the name, but the title felt archaic, impossibly out of place in the 21st century. "Lord Marlowe? He is the master of this estate, the last of his line, or he was. He's been unwell for almost a year." Dr. Bishop's eyes drifted to the rain. "He suffers from an incredibly rare, complex blood disorder. It's unlike anything I've ever encountered in any medical journal. Your thesis on atypical anticoagulants. That's why you're here. This case defies all known hematology." He took a slow breath, gathering his thoughts. "The disorder has induced a state of, let's call it, torpor, a profound unconsciousness, a metabolic suspension. He is kept in a specialized, temperature-controlled wing of the manor. He is, and this is the critical part, Leona, extremely, critically photosensitive. Sunlight is not an option. It's fatal. Even low-level ambient light is damaging." He let the weight of this sink in. His family rarely visits. There is a cousin, a Mr. Julian, who oversees the estate's finances from afar, but he is often away. The few staff here, like Mrs. Thorne, simply do their duties out of a long-held, grim obligation. But Lord Marlowe needs someone dedicated, someone who will actually care. Someone who understands the fragility of his condition and won't be spooked. Leona bit her lip, processing. A man in a coma, in a dark, cold, Gothic mansion. A man who couldn't touch the sun. Spooked by what, Eris? By the silence, by the isolation, by him, Dr. Bishop said bluntly. They treated him like a corpse. He is not a corpse. I still detect faint residual neural activity. I need someone who will treat him like a man. It was a daunting task, taking care of a man who might never wake up, in a house that felt like a tomb, a man whose conditions sounded like something from a penny dreadful novel. But her mother's final hospital bill was on her credit card, and the collection calls were relentless. The compensation Dr. Bishop had offered for 1 month was more than she used to make in a year. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Dr. Bishop's shoulders sagged in relief, a thin line of approval on his lips. "Good. Good. Your duties begin immediately." The north wing of the manor felt degrees colder than the rest of the house, a damp, penetrating chill that her sweater couldn't fight. As Dr. Bishop led her through another set of heavy, sound-dampening doors, the dim electric light of the hallway was extinguished. They were plunged into near-total darkness before a specialized deep red ambient lighting system set into the baseboards flickered to life, casting the corridor in an infernal glow. "His photosensitivity is absolute," Dr. Bishop murmured, his voice hushed as if in a church. "Even low-level conventional light causes a breakdown, a kind of cellular damage I can't explain. This specific red spectrum light is all his system can tolerate. You'll get used to it. Your eyes will adjust." The private suite, or rather, the bedchamber, was vast. It was a room built for a king, with dark, heavily carved oak furniture, towering tapestries that swallowed the sound, and a massive, four-poster bed at its center, draped in heavy velvet. All of it was cast in the eerie, deep red glow, which painted the shadows in shades of black and crimson. The air smelled of cold stone, old wood, and a faint, sharp tang of antiseptic, and something else. Something vaguely metallic, like old pennies. And in the center of the bed lay Lord Adrian Marlowe. Leona's breath hitched. She had expected someone withered, atrophied, sickly. Despite the tubes and the strange, archaic-looking monitoring equipment beside the bed, he was beautiful. It was the only word. Hauntingly, unnaturally beautiful. He had a strong, aristocratic jawline, high cheekbones, and a mouth that looked sculpted by a master. Thick, black hair, the color of a raven's wing, was fanned out against the pale, expensive linens. Dark lashes rested against skin so pale it was almost translucent, like alabaster, holding a terrifying cold luminosity under the red light. If not for the lifeless stillness, he could have been a man simply, peacefully sleeping. But this was no ordinary sleep. This was a man trapped in an unending, silent darkness. Leona swallowed hard, forcing her gaze away from his face as her professional instincts took over. She looked at the monitors. They were not standard hospital equipment. There was no EKG, no familiar heart rate numeric. One screen showed a single, slow, pulsing wave. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was a slow, deep, powerful swell, like a tide, rising and falling once every 10 seconds. A dark, viscous fluid, a deep, unsettling violet black, thick as crude oil, but moving with a strange, unnatural ease, dripped slowly from a chilled glass bottle into a port in his arm. "It's a specialized nutrient blend I've formulated," Dr. Bishop explained, seeing her clinical gaze. "It's the only thing his system will accept. Your primary duty will be to monitor these levels, check his vitals, such as they are, and maintain his physical integrity. Repositioning to prevent sores, cleaning. The standard care for a comatose patient." He placed a hand on Leona's shoulder. "I must return to my research in the lab. I'm trying to synthesize a counteragent, but it's slow work. Mrs. Thorne will bring your meals here. Do not, under any circumstances, open the curtains. And try to talk to him, Leona. I truly believe deep down he can hear." He left, and the heavy door clicked shut, sealing her inside the red-hued silence. It was deafening. There was no beep from a monitor, only the faint, slow whoosh, whoosh of the wave on the screen and the methodical drip, drip, drip of the dark fluid. Leona took a deep breath, the cold, metallic air filling her lungs. She rolled up her sleeves and moved to the bedside. She reached for the warm cloth and basin of water Mrs. Thorne had left prepared. She hesitated for just a second, gazing at his still, perfect face, before gently pressing the cloth against his skin, starting with his forearm. The moment she touched him, A sharp, violent jolt ran up her arm. It wasn't a simple static shock. It was a deep, invasive cold that seemed to leap from his skin to her bones, followed by a faint, tingling echo, like a tuning fork struck far away. It was the feeling of life, but a life she didn't recognize. She recoiled, her heart leaping into her throat, splashing water onto the floor. She stared at him, at the monitor. Nothing. His face was serene. The wave on the screen continued its slow, steady, tidal pulse. Shaking off the odd feeling, Leona attributed it to nerves, to the strange energy of the house, to the bizarre red light. Static electricity. It had to be. She took another, shakier breath and continued her work. Her touch careful, clinical, but her nerves were raw. She wiped his arms, his chest, his face, her hands trembling slightly. He felt less like a man and more like a marble statue. Beautiful and impossibly cold. "I guess you don't get a say in this, huh?" she murmured, her own voice startling her, sounding thin and reedy in the vast, quiet room. The silence that answered was vast and deep. "I'll take that as a no." A small, nervous smile tugged at her lips, despite herself. The days turned into a disorienting routine. The red-lit world of the North Wing became her entire existence. Every morning and every evening, she would bathe him, change his linens, monitor his strange vitals, and check the dark, life-sustaining fluid. But soon, it wasn't just about medical care. The silence was a crushing, tangible weight, and Dr. Bishop's words echoed in her mind. "I believe he can hear." So, she found herself talking to him. It was the only way to keep her own sanity, to remind herself that she was real. She told him stories about her day, about the rude, silent stare of Mrs. Thorne, about the world outside his window that she could only see from her own small room in the servants' quarters. "You should see the cafeteria food here, Adrian," she said one evening, gently massaging his cold, unresponsive hands, trying to work some life into the frozen joints. "Oh, wait, there isn't one. It's just whatever gray, boiled thing Mrs. Thorne decides to leave on a tray. It's tragic. Even for a comatose lord, I doubt you'd survive it." Silence. The slow whoosh of the monitor. "I don't even know why I'm talking to you," she sighed, dipping a clean washcloth into the warm water. "Maybe I just like the sound of my own voice. It's the only one I hear most days, other than Dr. Bishop asking if there's any change. No change, Doctor. Never any change." Silence. "Or maybe," she whispered, leaning closer to wipe a stray lock of black hair from his forehead, her fingers brushing his temple, "you're actually listening." The monitor pulsed steadily. Whoosh! 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 And maybe, just maybe, he was. Weeks bled into one another, turning the calendar pages into a meaningless blur. Leona's entire world was now defined by the deep, pervasive crimson of the North Wing, by the rhythmic whoosh of the monitor, and by the profound, chilling silence of her patient. She saw Dr. Bishop only for brief, whispered consultations in the hallway, where he looked increasingly haggard, his research yielding no answers. She saw Mrs. Thorne twice a day, a silent, disappreciating wraith who delivered her food trays and fresh linens, never speaking a word. Her eyes always averted from the bed. The isolation was a physical weight. Leona clung to her sanity by clinging to her routine, and her routine now included Adrian. She read to him. At first, it was clinical, passages from medical journals she was studying, but the dry texts felt wrong in the vast, Gothic room. So, she switched to a tattered paperback of poetry she'd brought, her voice soft as she read sonnets to the still marble man. "You know," she said one afternoon, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "I always thought this one was too sentimental. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" She sighed, closing the book. "You're more of a long, moonless night, if I'm being honest. No offense." She placed her hand on his forearm to begin his daily range of motion exercises. The familiar, icy jolt was still there. But she'd grown used to it. "Still cold. I don't know why I expect anything different." She moved to his hand, gently flexing the long, pale fingers. "Dr. Bishop is worried. I can see it. He thinks you're slipping. But I don't." She paused, her grip tightening on his hand. I don't think you are." As she spoke the words, she was staring intently at his ring finger. And then it happened. A flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible contraction. A ghost of a movement, pulling against her grip. Her breath lodged in her throat. Had she imagined it? The red light played tricks on the eyes, creating shadows that danced. She froze, staring at his hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Adrian?" she whispered. Nothing. The hand lay motionless, cold and still within hers. Leona let out a shaky laugh, pressing a hand to her chest. "Great. Now I'm hallucinating. I've officially been in this room too long. Maybe I'm the one who needs a nurse." But the unease, the spark of something, lingered. It happened again 2 days later. She was adjusting his pillow, her arm brushing against his shoulder. She wasn't looking at his hand when she felt it, the faintest pressure against her wrist. Her head snapped down. His hand, which had been lying palm up, had shifted. Only by a fraction of an inch. But it was different. The fingers were slightly curled. Her stomach flipped. "Adrian?" she whispered again, louder this time. The same rhythmic whoosh, whoosh of the monitor. She placed her warm hand over his. The cold was immediate, profound. There was no movement. Was she imagining things? Or was something deep inside that suspended body finally changing? She couldn't shake the feeling. She reported it, her voice trembling with a nervous excitement, to Dr. Bishop. "He moved," she said, catching him in the library. "I know you'll say it's impossible, but his fingers—" They twitched, and his hand moved. The doctor looked up from a heavy, ancient-looking tome, his eyes skeptical over his reading glasses. "Leona, I think so," she insisted. "At first, I thought I imagined it, but it's happened twice. It's small, but it's there. It's real." Dr. Bishop leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He looked profoundly tired. "We'll run some tests," he finally said, but his voice was flat, devoid of her hope. "But don't get your hopes up, Leona. It's almost certainly reflexive muscle spasms, involuntary contractions. It doesn't mean he's in there." She nodded. But a cold knot of disappointment and frustration formed in her stomach. He didn't believe her. Deep down, she knew it wasn't a spasm. She felt it. It had felt intentional. The next day, the monotony was broken by an event that sent a shockwave through the silent house. Mr. Julian arrived. Leona was in the room, charting the day's fluid intake, when the heavy door swung open without a knock. Mrs. Thorne stood there, her face even more severe than usual, and behind her stood a man who was the complete antithesis of Ravencrest Manor. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her car, and radiated a slick, polished charm. He had the same black hair as Adrian, but his eyes were a piercing, bright blue. He smelled of expensive cologne and the cold, clean scent of the outside world. And he brought a gust of it into the hermetic, sterile room. "And this must be the new nurse," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, his blue eyes raking over Leona in a way that made her feel instantly small. "The one Dr. Bishop praises so highly. Leona, is it?" "Leona Hayes, sir," she said, standing, her hands instinctively clasping in front of her. "Julian Marlowe," he said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My cousin's unfortunate guardian, one might say. I do so appreciate you taking on this grim little task. The last one, I heard, was rather hysterical." He glided past her, moving to the bedside, his polished shoes silent on the stone floor. He stood over Adrian, and the smile faded, replaced by a mask of perfect, rehearsed sorrow. "Ah, Adrian," he sighed, reaching out and brushing a stray lock of hair from his cousin's forehead. "Still sleeping. Still the tragic prince in his tower." Leona watched, and a strange, protective instinct flared in her. She didn't want this man touching him. As Julian's fingers grazed Adrian's skin, Leona thought she saw the wave on the monitor flicker, dip slightly, as if in response to a negative stimulus. "Any change at all, Miss Hayes?" Julian asked, turning his sharp gaze back to her, though he was still stroking his cousin's hair. "Any little twitches? Any flutters of the eyelids? Any sign that he's still in there?" The question was casual, but the intensity of his stare felt like an interrogation. Leona's mind flashed to the finger twitch, to her conversation with Dr. Bishop. "No, sir," she lied, the word tasting like ash. "Nothing like that. He's stable." Julian's smile returned, thin and satisfied. "Stable. Yes, that's the word Dr. Bishop keeps using. A stable condition." He looked around the red-lit room, a flicker of distaste crossing his features. "This whole setup, it's medieval. But Eris insists. He clings to his quaint little experiments." He clapped his hands together suddenly, a sharp, loud sound that made Leona jump and echoed horribly in the quiet. "Well, I've paid my respects. Do try to keep him stable, Miss Hayes. That's all we can ask, isn't it?" He was gone as quickly as he arrived, leaving behind the lingering scent of his cologne and a palpable, vibrating chill that was worse than the room's natural cold. Leona found her hands were shaking. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. There was something wrong with that man. Something predatory. That night, Leona felt restless, her nerves frayed by Julian's visit. The room felt darker, the silence more oppressive. She was preparing for her final rounds, checking the dark, viscous fluid that served as Adrian's only sustenance. The heavy, chilled glass bottle was always slippery. As she was working to unclamp the old tubing, her other hand, still trembling slightly from her encounter with Julian, fumbled with the small, sharp pair of medical scissors she used to cut the sterile tape. The scissors slipped. She cried out, a sharp, high sound, as the point dug deep into the fleshy part of her palm. It was a clean, deep cut. Blood, dark and shockingly vibrant under the red light, welled up instantly, spilling over her hand and dripping onto the white linens of the bed. "Damn it!" she hissed, clutching her hand. The pain sharp and sudden. And then, silence. The whoosh, whoosh of the monitor stopped. Leona froze, her own pain forgotten. The room was utterly, terrifyingly silent. The tidal wave on the screen had gone flat. "Oh my God!" she breathed. "No, no, no!" She turned to Adrian, her eyes wide with panic. His hand, the one near the bloodstain on the sheets, was clenched into a fist. Before she could process that, the monitor screamed. It wasn't a flat line. The wave spiked, a jagged, violent peak that went off the scale, and an alarm, A piercing, deafening tone she had never heard before blared through the room. And then, faster than any human could move, faster than she could even blink, Lord Adrian Marlowe's eyes snapped open. They weren't pale or confused. They were a brilliant, terrifying, luminous silver. And they were fixed on her, not on her face, on her bleeding hand. A sound tore from his throat, a low, guttural, inhuman groan of pure, agonizing hunger. He sat bolt upright. It wasn't the slow, weak movement of an invalid. It was the fluid, powerful coil of a predator. The tubes ripped from his arm, spraying the dark fluid across the bed. Leona couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was paralyzed. In the next instant, he was on her. He crossed the space between the bed and her in a blur, slamming her back against the stone wall. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. His strength was impossible. One hand pinned her wrists above her head, the other seized her chin, tilting her head back, exposing her throat. She was trapped, her feet dangling inches off the floor. She could smell him. The metallic, coppery scent she'd noticed before was now overwhelming, mixed with the smell of dust and something ancient. She could feel the unnatural cold of his body, even through her clothes, and she could see his face. The beautiful sculpted features were twisted into a feral, desperate mask. His lips were pulled back, and she screamed, a thin, choked sound, as she saw his fangs, sharp, white, and unmistakably real. He lowered his head, his silver eyes fixed on the pulse beating frantically in her neck. He was starving. He was going to kill her. "Adrian!" she screamed, the name ripping from her throat in pure animal terror. "No! Stop! It's me! It's Leona!" At the sound of his name, at the sound of her voice, his body went rigid. He froze, his fangs grazing her skin, the icy point sending a shock of terror through her. He didn't move for a long, agonizing second. Then he recoiled, as if he'd been shot. He released her, stumbling backward. Leona collapsed to the floor, gasping, scrambling away from him, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. He fell back against the bed, his impossible strength vanishing. He looked dazed. The feral silver light in his eyes flickered, dimmed, and was replaced by a profound human confusion. The fangs were gone, his features smoothing back into the beautiful sculpted face she knew. He looked from her, huddled on the floor, to the dark blood stain on his sheets, and then to his own hands, his brows furrowing. He looked weak, devastated. His chest rose and fell in ragged, shuddering breaths. His lips parted, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, rough from a year of disuse. "Your voice." Leona stared, her entire body shaking so violently she could barely breathe. I know your voice," he whispered, his gaze finding hers. His eyes, no longer silver, were a deep, clear, startling gray. You were in the dark. You were talking. You kept the dark away." He swallowed, his throat working. He was no longer a monster. He was the man Dr. Bishop had told her to find. But he was weak, and he was terrified. "He did this," Adrian murmured, his hand weakly gesturing to the IV stand he'd ripped out. "The poison in the fluid. He tried to bury me." "Who?" Leona whispered, her voice trembling. "Who did this?" Adrian's eyes met hers, and in them she saw a desperate, pleading intelligence. "He will come back. The one with the cold eyes. Julian." The name flashed in her mind. "He must not know," Adrian rasped, pushing himself further up on the bed, his arms shaking with the effort. "He thinks I am stable." He repeated the word Julian had used, his voice laced with a cold, new hatred. "Please, nurse, don't let him. No, he will finish it." Leona looked at her bleeding hand, at the terrified, impossible man in the bed, and at the blaring monitor that was still screaming its alarm. Her terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But her instincts, the nurse, the caregiver, surged past it. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring her own pain, and slammed her hand onto the monitor, silencing the alarm. The room plunged back into its deep red silence, broken only by their two sets of ragged breaths. She grabbed a clean towel, pressing it to her hand to staunch the blood. She was his nurse. But she was no longer just his nurse. She was his guardian, his only ally. "I won't," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She met his gaze, sealing the new, terrifying pact between them. "I won't let him know. I'll help you." The room was suspended in a terrifying, crimson-lit silence. The only sounds were Leona's ragged, panicked gasps and the harsh, shuddering breaths of the man, the creature, who was now slumped against the bed, his impossible strength gone as quickly as it had appeared. Leona scrambled backwards, crab-walking until her back hit the far wall. Her bleeding hand clutched to her chest, the towel already soaking through. He looked at her, his deep gray eyes, now cleared of the predatory silver, filled with a profound, agonizing confusion. "Your voice," he rasped again, his hand moving weakly to his own throat. It was the only thing in the dark for so long." Leona's mind was a siren, screaming, "Run, run, run!" But her body was frozen. Her professional training was a tiny, flickering light in the storm of her terror. Patient is conscious. Patient is distressed. Patient is a vampire. That last thought was hysterical, impossible, yet undeniably true. She had seen the fangs. She had felt that impossible, cold strength. Who are you?" she stammered, the question sounding absurd. "Adrian," he whispered. "Lord Marlowe." He coughed, a dry, dusty sound. "And I am dying. He poisoned me." "Julian," Leona breathed, the name tasting like venom. Adrian nodded, his gaze sharp. He thinks I am buried, trapped. This torpor. It was his design. A living tomb." "Dr. Vader, Bishop," Leona started. "Eris is a good man, but a fool," Adrian rasped. "He does not know the fluid he gives me. It is not sustenance. It is the poison. Julian supplies the formula. Eris just replicates it. He thinks he is keeping me alive. He is maintaining my prison." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The secret research, the isolation, Dr. Bishop's haggard appearance. He was failing to save a patient he was actively, unknowingly, poisoning. Leona forced herself to stand, her legs shaking. She was a nurse. This was a patient. A very, very unusual patient. "The blood," she said, her voice trembling. My hand. It woke you." His eyes closed in something like shame. "The scent. It cut through the fog. The hunger. I am sorry. I would not have." "You stopped," Leona said, the realization hitting her. He was a starving monster, and he had stopped. "You heard my voice, and you stopped." He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not a predator, but a prisoner. "You are not afraid," he murmured, a statement of disbelief. "I am terrified," Leona said honestly, wrapping the towel tighter around her bleeding palm. "But my job is to help you. And right now, you are my patient." She took a deep, steadying breath. "That fluid is poison. What do you need? What do you—" "Eat." A flicker of that silver light passed through his eyes. "Blood," he whispered. "I need blood. Without it, I will fall back into the dark. This time, I will not wake." This was the test. The bright, clear line. Her medical ethics warred with her survival instinct. But looking at him, weakened, desperate, and betrayed, she saw only the man she had been reading poetry to. "Dr. Bishop has a lab," she said, her mind racing. "He's a hematologist. He has supplies, blood stores, for his research." "Yes," Adrian breathed, hope dawning in his eyes. "Okay," Leona said, her terror solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. "Okay, I have to clean this room. I have to fix the IV so it looks normal, and I have to tend to my hand. Then I will go to the lab. You have to promise. You won't. I will not harm you," Adrian vowed, his voice gaining a fraction of strength from her promise. "You are my only hope. Julian, he will be back. He senses it. I felt him when he was here. He was probing the darkness. He will come to finish it." Time was running out. Leona moved with a frantic, focused energy. She raced to the bathroom, washed her wound, and applied a tight pressure bandage. She cleaned her own blood from the floor and the sheets, her heart hammering. She retaped the ripped-out IV port to Adrian's arm, letting the dark, poisonous fluid drip onto a towel hidden under the blankets, the bottle slowly, convincingly emptying. She reset the monitors, which had returned to their slow, tidal whoosh as soon as Adrian's feral energy had subsided. The room, within 10 minutes, looked exactly as it had before. She gave Adrian a last, nervous look. He was lying perfectly still, the perfect image of a comatose man. But his gray eyes were wide open, tracking her every move. "I'll be back," she whispered. She slipped out of the room, her heart in her throat. The manor was silent. She crept down the cold corridors to the library, and then to the small, modern lab Dr. Bishop had built in an adjoining study. It was, as she'd guessed, stocked like a specialized blood bank. Bags of blood, animal, she assumed, and hoped, were kept in a medical-grade refrigerator. She grabbed one, her hands shaking, and hid it under her scrubs. She also grabbed a clean IV bag. Back in the room, she worked quickly. She disconnected the poison, flushing the line with saline, and connected the bag of blood. She hid the bag under the blankets, the line running alongside the official IV. The effect was instantaneous. As the cold, dark blood entered his system, a faint flush rose in Adrian's cheeks. It was like watching a wilted flower drink water. His breathing deepened, becoming less ragged. "It is not enough," he whispered, his voice already stronger, the rasp fading. "The poison, it is ancient, designed by my ancestors, enemies. Julian found the formula. It binds to my cells. It requires an antidote." "Where is it?" Leona asked, crouching by the bed. "In the library. Julian is arrogant. He would keep the cure near the poison. He fancies himself a scholar. There is a book, the Marlowe lineage, a false binding. Inside his notes, the formula. Look for a chapter on stasis." "I'll go," she said. "He is here. Adrian said suddenly, his eyes darting to the door, his new strength bringing a new, sharp perception. In the house, he felt the awakening. He's come back to confirm it. Leona's blood ran cold. What do I do? Nothing, Adrian said, his eyes closing, his body sinking back into that perfect, death-like stillness. Be the nurse. I am asleep. I am stable. Go. She forced herself to breathe. She walked out of the room, her heart a cold stone in her chest. And just as she stepped into the main hall, Julian emerged from the library, a cruel, knowing smile on his face. Miss Hayes, working so late, he purred, blocking her path. Mr. Marlowe, you're back soon, she stammered. I felt a disturbance in the estate's finances, he said, his blue eyes glittering with malice. Tell me, how is my cousin? Any new twitches? He's the same, Leona said, forcing her voice to be flat. Stable. Julian's smile widened. He tilted his head, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. You're a bad liar, nurse. I believe I'll see for myself. I think it's time for a new treatment. He pulled a small, ornate syringe from his coat pocket, filled with a dark, oily liquid, the final fatal dose. You can come and watch. A final lesson. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a steel trap, and dragged her back toward the north wing. Leona's mind raced. The antidote. The book. Adrian was still too weak. Julian was going to kill him, and her with him. He threw the door open. Adrian lay still, the picture of unconsciousness. Stop the charade, cousin, Julian spat, releasing Leona and striding to the bed. The little mouse's blood. It woke you, didn't it? It broke through the barrier. How inconvenient. Adrian's eyes snapped open. He sat up, but it was a clear effort. The blood had helped, but the poison was still winning. Julian, he growled, his voice a low vibration of hatred. In the flesh, Julian sneered, holding up the syringe. I am impressed. You held on, but this is over. The throne is mine. He lunged, not at Adrian's chest, but at the IV port, aiming to inject the poison directly into his bloodstream. Adrian caught his wrist, his strength pitted against Julian's. But Adrian was a man starved for a year, his body saturated with toxins. Julian was strong, healthy, and fueled by greed. Julian slammed his other fist into Adrian's side, forcing a grunt of pain from him. He pinned Adrian back against the headboard, the syringe high, ready to plunge. Goodbye, cousin. Say hello to oblivion. Leona looked wildly around the room. The book. The antidote. It was all hopeless. But her eyes landed on the medical tray she had left by the bed. Her tools. Her world. Julian was focused on Adrian, his back partially to her. Adrian's eyes met hers, desperate. He needed a nurse, Leona said, her voice shaking but loud. Julian laughed, a short, ugly sound, not even turning. And he got a fool. No, Leona said, her hand darting to the tray. He got a hematologist. She wasn't grabbing a weapon. She was grabbing a syringe, a large 50cc lure lock, the kind used for drawing large blood samples. With impossible speed, her hands steady now, she plunged the needle into the tube of the blood bag she had hidden, drawing it full of the cold, life-giving blood. Before Julian could react, before he could even process what she'd said, Leona plunged the large-bore needle directly into his exposed neck, into his carotid artery. Julian roared. It was a sound of shock and animalistic pain. He released Adrian, stumbling back, clutching his throat. But Leona wasn't done. She pushed the plunger down. It wasn't poison. It was something worse. For him. She was injecting Adrian's blood. The blood of the true king, saturated with a year's worth of ancient poison, directly into Julian's veins. "You want his legacy?" she screamed, pushing the last of it in. "You can have it." Julian tore the syringe from his neck. He stared at her, his blue eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. He looked down at his own hands, which were beginning to tremble. A gray, deathly pallor was spreading up his arms. He had poisoned Adrian to induce the great slumber. And now, Leona had given him a catastrophic, accelerated dose of his own medicine. "You," he gurgled, stumbling. "You, bitch!" He collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing, the torpor he had weaponized now claiming him in seconds. He fell to the floor, his eyes open and vacant, frozen in a silent scream. He was not dead. He was stable. Leona was panting, the empty syringe falling from her numb fingers. The room was silent. She looked up at Adrian. He was staring at her, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock, horror, and profound, unadulterated awe. He slowly, weakly got out of the bed. He stood over his cousin's motionless body. "He will not wake. Not for 1,000 years." He turned to Leona. "You saved my life." Leona finally let out the breath she'd been holding and slid down the wall, her legs giving out. A week later, the manor felt different. Lighter. Dr. Bishop, horrified and ashamed after Adrian's explanation, was working tirelessly, and this time with his patient, to synthesize the true antidote. Julian's body had been removed, taken by imposing silent figures who answered to Adrian. The manor was no longer a tomb. Leona stood in the library, her small suitcase packed, a generous check in her pocket. Adrian stood by the fireplace, no longer a patient, but a lord. He was dressed in a dark robe, his strength returning. The color in his face, real. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. "My job is done," Leona said softly. "You're safe. I am in your debt. That check is nothing. I can give you anything. A house, a new life, safety, wealth. You will never want for anything." Leona looked at the fire. "I didn't do it for a reward, Adrian. I just did my job." He stepped closer, his presence no longer chilling but warm. "No," he said, his voice soft. "You did more. You came into a dark room. You saw a monster, a creature of myth, and you did not run." I'm a nurse," she whispered. "I see the patient, not the condition." "You," he said, gently taking her bandaged hand, "saw me. You looked past the cold skin, past the fangs, past the horror, and you read poetry to the man inside, the man who was trapped." Leona looked up at him, and in that moment she realized the truth of her time here. She had come to Ravencrest terrified of the isolation, trapped by her own life's debts. She had been tasked with caring for a medical curiosity, a man defined only by his unnatural, cold condition. But she had refused to see him as just that. She realized that this was the lesson. True compassion, true care, isn't just about healing a body or following a chart. It's about having the courage to look past the superficial, to ignore the prejudices and the fear. It's about choosing to see the person inside the illness, or the monster. She had learned that the most unnatural being, the one feared by the world, could possess a will to live, a capacity for trust, and a heart more human than the civilized, polished man who had tried to murder him. The real monster wasn't the one with fangs. It was the one with the cold, ambitious heart. "I am asking you to choose," Adrian said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. "You can leave. Be safe. Be human. Forget this ever happened. Or you can stay." He paused, his gray eyes searching hers. "It is a dangerous life. A life lived in shadow. But you will never be alone. And you will never be in the dark." Leona looked at the packed bag, then back at his face. She thought of the cold, silent room, and how her voice had been the only thing in it. And she thought of how his voice, in the end, had become the only one she wanted to hear. "I'm not afraid of the shadows, Adrian," she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. She reached up and put her hand on his cheek. It was still cool, but it was no longer cold. I think I'll stay." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a true, warm smile spreading across his face. And for the first time, in the ancient Gothic manner, Leona Hayes felt like she was finally home.